Welcome to Drinks in the Library, the only library where drinks aren't just allowed, they are required. I'm your librarian host, Gigi Howard, and each episode I'll be interviewing a guest about a much-loved book that we will be pairing with a drink for you to enjoy along with us or consider for your next book club meetup. As always, stay curious and support your local library. Hello, Libration Nation. This week we are diving into Parable of the Sower by the legendary Octavia Butler. If you haven't read it yet, get ready. It's powerful, thought-provoking, and for better or for worse, it feels more relevant now than ever. My guest this week is the lovely Gretchen Gales, a writer, teacher, editor, and occasional artist. Her first poetry chapbook, Agora, from Alien Buddha Press 2023, is available now. Gretchen's work has also appeared in Ms., Huffington Post, Next Avenue, Your Tango, Well and Good, and others. See more of her work at www.writinggales.com. Our drink this week is a green tea highball, which pairs with Earthseed. If you've read the book, you know that is a major plot point to the story. And if you haven't read the book, now is your chance. And one last thing, if you're loving this podcast, please do me a favor. Take a moment this week to give us a review, 5-star rating, and most importantly, tell 2 friends about Drinks in the Library this week. It really makes a huge difference and helps us grow. All right. Let's get to it.
I don't do it on paper, then I'm not going to follow through with it.
Yeah.
So just making sure that's a thing. Any poems, any fiction that I might write or
cool.
nonfiction.
So you're a writer?
I still am a writer, yes.
Okay, yeah. What kind of stuff do you write?
I've mostly been writing like nonfiction and poetry for the most part. I have a couple of fiction stories.
Oh.
I publish one maybe once every 5 years when I have a decent idea and that comes out. But it's mostly been poetry, and I've done some journalistic stuff for like the Huffington Post.
Really?
Well and Good published one of my stories last year. So like I said, I've been taking a little bit of a step back to like step into this new role of special education teacher, but I still, like, being a writer is still a very inherent part of me. I also, for a long time, and I still technically am, I need to get back into it after a hiatus, was an editor of a literary magazine as well, so.
That's awesome. What's the name of the magazine?
Quail Bell Magazine.
Okay. Wow. Okay.
Yes.
I'm very impressed. It's awesome.
It's like, where do I sprinkle that in? Like, I have lived at least 5 lives between now and probably when I turned 20, so I'm like, oh my god, where do I even start?
Like I said, I'm impressed. That's a lot. Very cool, and I'm really glad to have you with me today. And we're talking about The Parable of the Sower by Octavia Butler. And I always ask you, so who were you when you first picked up this book?
Oh gosh, I was a 26-year-old woman trying to figure out, or trying to, I think I just bought my house and I had moved in and I hadn't gotten all my furniture back in yet. So I was laying on an air mattress just on the floor and I was bored, and someone probably a couple months earlier had asked me like, oh, what's your favorite Octavia Butler book? I was like, I haven't read any. And she said, what? And it was like the biggest sin I could have committed. Like, I haven't yet. Which one should I start with? She was like, any of them. Just start. And again, during summer break in a pandemic time, it's a pretty good time to start a book. I had no excuse at that point. And I had seen it circulating around in most recommended lists. And I said, I really do not have an excuse at this point. So I got the ebook version because it was only $1. It was on sale. And it wasn't available at my library at the time. It would have been on hold for 4 weeks. And by that point, I would have moved on to something else. So
that's always the pro and the con. It's free, but you might have to wait.
You might have to wait.
Yeah.
And I love the Libby app and other related things. What is it? Libby, and then there's Hoopla. Hoopla, yes. So same thing where it's, if I wait, that's great and it will show up, but it might not be there by the time I end up hyper-focusing on something else. So
I'm the same way. Yeah. Like, I will be like, I have to read this, like, right now.
And it passes, so you can't do it.
I feel that.
But I had downloaded it, and I started reading it, and I was very surprised by like how conversational it is. The main character, Lauren, has a very distinct voice. I think a lot of Octavia Butler's writing has a very distinct voice. I read Kindred first, because I think that was the one that was through Libby that was available right at that moment. And I said, all right, this is the one. I'm starting off with that one. And then after that, with Parable of the Sower, I was like, let's just continue this on.
Yeah.
And so I had picked that up, and I just found it so, like, it's the kind of dystopian book that, like, I read as a kid, like, the kind of the ones that are, like, a little bit, like, too on the nose real, where it's very, very possible and something could happen, or, like, the realities of what that world is are not hidden from you just because you're a child. And especially with this being an adult book, they're really not hidden. Like, you are not shielded from anything in this book. So I had to put it down a couple of times where I was like, whoa, all right. Especially when it came to, I think someone described it, I think Octavia Butler herself described it as one of the dystopians of not a what if or a when, just if you continue down this path. And she wrote it as what she imagined it would be like actually now, because it takes place in 2024, of what would happen with climate change, political instability, what all these things happening at the same time, and it just progressively getting more aggressive as time goes on.
Yeah. So guide us through the story a little bit. I know our protagonist is Lauren.
Yes.
Yeah. So who is Lauren? How does it get started?
So Lauren is part of one of very few communities that is still protected, still has a little bit of layer of protection with barricades around, but most of the outer world at this point has been ravaged by fires, by other impacts of climate change, different people like thieves and like gangs who will come around and destroy and loot and take everything. And so she's growing up in this community, and it's very much a coming of age story where at the beginning of the novel she's 15. And so we can see things from her perspective where her father is raising her and telling her, like, hey, help take care of kids in the community, let's do this. And her father's also very religious. I believe, if I remember correctly, he's supposed to be a Baptist preacher, and so very much has that influence of religion. And Lauren's kind of like, you know, I'm not really into this much, but I will do whatever my father asks of me, and starts having these bigger thoughts. And eventually her brother gets a little rebellious and is, I don't want to live life in this little community anymore. I want to see the outside world. And he wanders off, and I'm not going to say what happens to him, but basically don't get attached to people in this book.
Oh, no.
So just do not get attached to people. And that's why Lauren is like the main name. Like, I will always have to look back at the names of some of the other characters just because it's, all right, we have you for about 20 more pages. And before something, spoiler alert, happens in that concept. And Lauren is also, so an interesting thing about her is that her mother had abused drugs, and so she came born not with a drug addiction, but she has something called hyperempathy. So she can literally feel the pain of other people. So, for example, if someone gets a paper cut, she can feel it immediately. If someone trips over a rock and falls, she can probably feel that sensation as well. So that's an extra layer of complication in a world where it's filled with violence and all sorts of misery, and she can feel every single aspect of it.
Wow. So, what is that like for her?
It's very challenging, but it makes her grow up very quickly. I think that's one of the things of the book where it's very clear of she's 15, but already at 15 she's grown up because she's had to.
Yeah.
You know, when she is speaking and she's writing, it's kind of, oh, this is like a 25-year-old. Nope, that's a 15-year-old who lives in a very dystopian, broken down society. So she has to do that. Again, feeling the pain of the people around her. And eventually, and this is a key part of the book, her community does fall after a couple of years, after finally people kind of raid it and come in. And it is very graphic and descriptive of exactly what happens when it has gotten to that point. And the exact thoughts that Lauren thinks in order to preserve like her own life, and being very frank about it, of not being like her brother who's, no, nothing bad's gonna happen, it's gonna be really cool out here. And it was not. Even disguising herself as a man when she is walking along different trails and she's trying to travel north to try and get to different communities that might have jobs or more resources that she might not have to compete as much for. Picks up some people along the way, and she starts her own religious thinking, like her very own spiritual journey called Earthseed, where she's writing down these I would say like scripture, like her own musings in a book called The Books of the Living, where the idea of God to her is that God is change and that God is essentially what you make of trying to better your circumstances. She's just like Butler. Butler was like, there's no utopia because that would imply there's a perfect human, and we have not had one of those yet, and we may never have one of those. So just finding a community that continuously do better and just strive to be the best that they can be in those circumstances. And the big talking point of the book is that, ironically, just like today, colonizing Mars and being like, eventually we're going to have to be on Mars, and we are training this new group of people who are resilient and can stay together to eventually go on Mars as their destiny.
Yeah. So a lot of the story is a little bit forward thinking, I think. Is that something that spoke to you when you were reading it?
It definitely was. And again, it was just so scary how it's like, the year is 2024, and it was 2021 at the time, and I was like, this is a little bit too on the nose. And even when I was reading it, I was like, oh, wow. But even people it was written in 93, and people were calling Octavia Butler a prophet after Hurricane Katrina, because the way that she had described all these things happen was very reminiscent of what had happened then. And people were like, oh, she's a prophet. And she's like, no, don't call me a prophet. Just call me someone it's like a warning, essentially. Like someone is giving a warning. And she said, this is a warning for what is exactly going to happen. And I think she's very much like a pattern recognition kind of person. So being able to see exactly what trail it's going down was very easy for her to do. So definitely I liked that forward thinking and how different it was as compared to a lot of the sci-fi I had growing up, where again, it's a really wacky circumstance that happens. One of the books I read as a kid was Life as We Knew It, where I think a meteor hits the moon and the moon gets really close to the Earth and it affects the gravitational pull. So it's again those one-off things where that's a very big what if, but in this circumstance, no, we're here and we are accelerating towards that. So that was very different.
Yeah, to pick that up. And so what other like aspects of the story like spoke to you when you picked it up? Did you see, yourself as a young Lauren as yourself as a young person or anything like that?
I just really appreciated the voice. I think any book that has a young protagonist like that, that's something when I think I was reading an article that said a lot of young adult books speak to so many different people because we can all remember the feeling of being a young adult. And so that definitely starts there. And I did feel that same way she felt of like being a little bit more mature at her age and grappling with the fact of, hey, there's a lot of stuff going on, a lot of different responsibilities, and juggling those while also trying to figure out what's next. Yeah. Where else are we going? And so I think that's just a big part that spoke to me. Yeah. Yeah.
Is that how you were as a young person, I guess?
I was definitely a lot more optimistic than Lauren was, but I didn't live Lauren's situation. But definitely kind of like the mature of me, like doing, not necessarily childcare, but I would do some babysitting at church sometimes, things like that, where I'm like, I have to be this responsible person in order to have the future that I want. And Lauren has that same thought process, but for all of humanity. It's not really a choice at this point. You got to do what you got to do to survive.
Yeah. So we talked a lot about Lauren. Who are some of the other characters that that play a role, I guess, for a long period or a short period before they get killed off?
I always have to remember there's two travelers who meet up with her, Harry and Zara. So two survivors who are from Lauren's neighborhood, like the only other survivors from the neighborhood at that point. Because in that part of the story, her brother Keith has passed away, spoiler alert, and her father is presumed dead. They never found a body, but he went out to do business and he didn't come back. And they were already a very tight-knit community. One of the big focuses of the book is mutual aid, so being very close in the community and being the help that other people seek. And so I think it was really easy for them to work together and figure out like, hey, we're not going to get anywhere if we're trying to kill each other. We need to go in a pack here. So they are, I'd say, like a familiar faces in very ever-changing circumstances, and they are quick to be like this Earthseed thing, which I guess if you're in that situation, that seems more optimistic than what we have. So definitely having that. And then later she meets a doctor who, let's see, gosh, how do I even avoid spoilers? But she meets a doctor, and you'll see more later of what goes on with that. But he's like a much older man, and he also assumes that she's much older than she is because of the way that she presents herself. And so that's a whole other thing, but he has access to communities and land from the Pacific Northeast and other areas as well where they can settle. So those are a lot of those characters. And then kind of side ones where she's looking at other people who join their community but may wander off or something happens. So it's like very Lauren based. Like even when looking up as a refresher, like any kind of summarizations, it's very clear on this is very much Lauren's story. Even in the graphic novel version, you see, because there is a graphic novel version that came out a couple of years ago.
Oh, cool, I didn't know about that.
Along with Kindred as well. So if you're ever like, I don't have time to read the full Kindred, and I like pretty pictures, you got it. The same thing with Parable of the Sower, but again, they don't shy away from the very mature, like, extreme themes in the book with the graphic novel either. So if you're squeamish, just remember that.
Yeah.
Yeah, for the most part, very much like her coming of age story and what that means to her.
Yeah. What does the book have to say about, like, community? Because you touched on that quite a bit. I always think of, like, how important it is to have a strong-knit community. Right. Does that play a role in the story?
That definitely does, because the reason why Lauren's community, her childhood community, lasted as long as it did was because of the mutual aid that they were providing one another. So she was teaching the children how to read. Other people were going out and trying to find food and other sources of water, anything like that. So just consistently looking out for one another as opposed to being like hoarding resources or saying, no, you don't deserve to have X, Y, and Z because I need it. So I do definitely think that community is an essential part of that message because the implication is without community, you would not survive. Right. And I think community is something, even for introverts like me, I'm like, I do have to occasionally come out and see people. That's just a part of the human experience, no matter what.
Yeah. I think it's so important, for sure, when we were going through the pandemic, for example, and there was a lot of uncertainty at that time, and I was so grateful. The people across the street are our best friends. And so it was just nice to have someone right there. And then, like, so many other people that live just in our neighborhood. Like, were involved. I was texting someone today who's going through something hard. And she was just like, I'm so grateful that we have this community. And it's really beautiful.
Definitely. It's something as I'm growing older. I get to turn 30 this year, so.
Yay! Happy birthday!
I'm like, yay! I got a couple more months. I'm good. I got until September. But it's still that idea of shifting communities of some people are going off having families, some people are moving away. So I'm also trying to find, like, what is my idea of community and what is that going to look like for me as I am moving forward?
Yeah.
Because I just moved into another house in a different neighborhood
Okay.
with my boyfriend, figuring out between like me and him and then the neighbors around and then our parents and our friends who can also provide help. Like when the water thing happened a couple of weeks ago.
Oh my gosh.
We were like one of the only houses not impacted by it. I was like, who needs water?
Yeah, I know. So if you're listening to this and you're not in the Richmond area, what was it like? It was right after we had the big snowstorm.
It was after the giant snowstorm. Yeah. And something about the water systems in Richmond just broke.
Yeah.
Something was off and it couldn't pump the water and everyone in like the Richmond area and the surrounding counties did not have access to water.
Yeah.
And it was absolutely horrific.
For like a whole week. Yeah, it was horrible. So we never lost it. Here, I've said before, I live in Chesterfield. So Chesterfield never lost it. But it was like a domino thing. Like your friend, like people in Richmond didn't have it. And then all of a sudden, Hanover didn't have it. And then all of a sudden, Henrico didn't have it. And it was just like, oh my gosh, how long until we're all down? But
I know.
It was horrible.
And I work in New Kent, which is in between like Hanover and Williamsburg. And let me tell you, the kids were so mad they had to go to school because every other county did not have to because of the water. I was like, guys, you want water. I don't know how else to tell you that you really do want water.
Yeah.
But most of them have wells because it's out in a very rural area. And they were like, why can't our water break? I said, you don't want that.
No, you don't want it because it's things like, one of my best friends lives in Hanover, and so she was saying, like, she couldn't even, like, cook dinner because how am I going to wash my hands? So we're just eating out. She came, and actually she took a shower here, everything. So it sounds like you had a similar experience. You were hosting people.
Exactly. Where we're kind of like, anybody need anything?
Yeah.
And thankfully, for the most part, like, no one needed to come over to shower or anything. They were just kind of like, do you have a little extra water so I can cook my pasta?
Yeah.
Like, yep, we sure do. Here you go.
But yeah, it's so important to have community. And I feel today we've just become so isolated in so many different ways.
Definitely.
Is that something that Octavia Butler foresaw? It sounds like she knew the importance of it, but...
I definitely think so. I think American culture in general is, like, very individualistic, very much like doing the best for yourself, which absolutely take care of yourself because you can't pour from an empty cup. But it's also been a big TikTok thing, at least on my algorithm, where people are talking about how the lack of community is dissolving us from each other and from our own mental health because we need other people.
Yeah.
And some of the rhetoric of, you don't need anybody else, you just live for yourself all the time. No, you really do need to sometimes, not just sometimes, but regularly have some sort of community to check in
100%.
with and give back what you can and then receive what you need to have as well. And I think that pretty much covers it.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it does make me nervous when I hear about people are growing up in such isolation, and social media is supposed to connect us, but I think it actually ends up doing the opposite. Yeah.
I think we were just talking about earlier that Jonathan Haidt book, the Anxious Generation one. And there's a couple of points in there where I've seen some criticism about the way he's kind of like, all these things are happening, so it must only be the phones. But I'm like, I don't think it's just solely the phones. I do still think it's a big factor, because I noticed when... I misplaced my phone for a couple of hours, and I was like, I have nothing else to do, so I'm going to go actually be productive. I was like, wow, I'm getting a lot more things done, and I feel just genuinely happier, too. I don't feel like I'm looking through and I'm like, I'm so behind in life. Why don't I have 5 books out? Why don't I have this size house or whatever? And I'm like, wait, I don't care about that.
Yeah.
It's like, I don't even care about that. Why am I so concentrated on it? And it's because, again, it's formulated specifically to make you, like, keep clicking and scrolling and have that just, like, self-hatred. I was about to say, like, self-doubt, but I'm like, no, sometimes it is, like, self-hatred where you're, like, again, just scrolling. No, I want X, Y, and Z.
I know.
And it just looks like something different behind the scenes. That's just their version that's been curated for the internet, just like you have your version of yourself curated for the internet.
Guess what? I'm never putting my worst days online. Nope. No one is ever seeing the truth. You will see my good days for sure.
Absolutely.
And so you're having a sip of the drink. So I always do bring it up. It is, so Earthseed, the book is earthy kind of thing. So you suggested that. And there is, like, a drink called, like, the Octavia that is named after her, but the ingredients for it were very...
out there.
They were hard to find, and there's part of me that's like, oh, I should try to make the best possible drink. But then I also think about if someone is using this podcast to, like, pair drinks with books, they're also going to have a hard time finding these ingredients. Right. So anyhow, I just started looking up, like, earthy cocktails. So it's called a green tea highball.
And it's good.
Yeah, it's really good. I actually didn't use green tea. I used chamomile because I had a honey chamomile tea, and I thought that sounds more earthy and we don't have to worry about caffeine and things.
Right.
But yeah, it's bourbon, lemon, simple syrup, and club soda. Oh, and also the tea. So anyway, I'm so glad you're enjoying this with me to discuss the Octavia book. Let's see, some of the other questions I have. I did want to ask you, because I don't know a lot about Octavia Butler. Do you know much about her?
So what I know about her specifically, I got into her backstory, especially because... So Parable of the Sower is the first of what was supposed to be a trilogy. Okay. So there are 2 books out, Parable of the Sower and Parable of the Talents, and the last one was supposed to be Parable of the Tricksters. Octavia, unfortunately, passed away after she had a fall outside of her house in 2006 at the age of 58. She had a lot of different things planned out that she was going to write and never got to that 3rd book. I think she may have had, like, little odds and ends, as we all do as writers, like putting little, like, sticky notes somewhere, but other than that, there wasn't really a cohesive project that was around to be published posthumously. What else about her? She was very introverted. So growing up, she was very much into staying in the library, reading a bunch of books, kind of keeping to herself, and telling herself stories and being very imaginative in that way, and engaging with especially science fiction, which is what she's known for, and being an absolute innovator in that genre, and really putting kind of a Black feminist spin on all of that. So again, I think that's what makes it so different, is it's from a perspective of cultures you don't see as often in sci-fi. And so it's fascinating when you're reading, you're like, wow, like this is a whole different way to see this, or a very direct way to see it. And the genre, I want to say it's called mundane sci-fi, like when it's a system or a circumstance where it's like your modern day, where it's not like very advanced sci-fi, but as I think it was John Green who was talking about it, he was like, it's the furthest thing from mundane. I agree with that, because it is very much like involved with chaos, and there's so much world building in there, as well as just such a focus on the world that Lauren hopes to build.
Yeah. And going back into that, she's a Black feminist sci-fi writer. I mean, at the time when she wrote this in 1993, I don't know if there were other women like her writing, or let's be honest, being published in that space.
Right. I'm not sure off the top of my head either. That's a good project for me to figure out, because I absolutely love her work, and the Afrofuturism movement as well, I know, has spawned other books that are inspired by her work that I have on my shelf at the moment, again, on my never-ending to-read list, as I'm sure you have as well, where you're like, like my favorite hobby is actually collecting the books.
That's my life. I'm constantly reading, and it's never enough.
It's never, you're like, I'm never going to be able to read all these books before I'm like, God, I hate this.
Yeah, I know. So it's, same. Yeah. So, but I think it's important. I was just reading about the book and reading about her a little bit, and just thinking about, so often we have sci-fi stories, but they're not centered on someone that looks like me or looks like her. And this is a story about a young Black woman navigating in this dystopian sort of sci-fi society. Right. Yeah. So I thought that was really cool, and hopefully that opened up the door for more people to write these kinds of stories.
Absolutely. Because I think there's a couple of Hugo Award winners that got inspiration from Octavia Butler. It's like that's the first time they ever saw someone like them in that kind of book. Yeah. Which is so essential. I actually have Tourette syndrome, and one of the biggest things that I've noticed is the very big underrepresentation of what that looks like for a lot of people. Okay. Which most people are like, oh, that's when you like say rude things to people and you can't help it. I'm like, in some cases, yes, but that's not always the case. And being able to find books that showcase actual characters who were very similar to me was important, because I was like, hey, wait a minute, this is very familiar to me. Oh, I could do this or write something about this because it is important, and it is something that I can aspire to be, or different attitudes of how they handled their own struggles with it, not only with just the disability itself, but other people's perception, because that's over half of it is other people's perceptions when you have a condition like that. Same thing with any kind of representation is so essential, and that's why I love seeking out specifically small literary journals who publish works like that, because it's like, ooh, like this is where we're getting like the new fresh batch who might not normally be picked up by, you know, different lists, or if they're not traditionally in like an MFA program, which if you're lucky, you get a full funded ride there and hope for the best, but it can be very exclusionary. It can be very expensive. A lot of people, I have a colleague I respect dearly and have worked with for a long time, and she just started school in Columbia a couple of weeks ago, and she said, without a scholarship, this would not have been possible. And I would say the majority of the people who attend like Ivy Leagues or these big schools have very privileged backgrounds where it doesn't disrupt their life to go off on a little adventure and come back. And they have the time to write down their experiences and stories, opposed to other people who have to make a lot of money to work for a living and just don't have the uninterrupted time that people in an MFA program do to be able to do that. And the other thing is, they very much, from what I know about it, I feel like I've gotten a bigger perspective of the literary world from just going off and just reading the literary journals myself and going through, because my boyfriend has an MFA, and he was like, you're probably like a little bit more well-versed, at least in that regard, of the different journals and other things. He very much stuck around to like the traditional literary journals, which have been criticized a lot for being, again, exclusionary or kind of cherry picking, like, this is what art is. This is what art is, when people have such a different perspective of what it can be. And I've definitely seen that in different reviews of books where I'll look and the main complaint is, I don't know if this is true art.
What does that mean?
I'm like, what is the qualifications to be true art to you? And they never explain. That's the thing that where I know, or I'm like, okay, we're just complaining to complain.
Yeah.
But yeah, art is so many different things to different people and can be so therapeutic and so needed, especially at a time like this where I would say post-pandemic, but COVID's still around. So post-shutdown, I suppose. But still, we have all these things happening that are confusing and overwhelming.
Yeah.
And we definitely need to have people who understand each other at this time.
Yeah. Yeah, 100%. I did want to ask, where is the book set?
It is set in California. I want to say it's just outside of Los Angeles. So, again, very timely, because what did we have at the beginning of the year? The Los Angeles fires, and that's the implication in the book that it's been ravaged by wildfires, other things that are happening. So, it is on that West Coast where, again, we see, like, the earthquakes, we see the fires, we see all these other things happening.
Yeah.
So, we don't really get a perspective of what the East Coast looks like or anything, but it is set right there, I think, like I said, just outside of Los Angeles, a smaller community.
Okay. Yeah. So, yeah, it's having seen what we just saw with the Los Angeles fires, it's horrible. And yeah, so I guess once again, she was like predicting the future a little bit. I wanted to ask you, like, so this is a little bit like a dystopian sci-fi kind of story. Do you read a lot of those kinds of stories? What do you read?
So I've really been on a nonfiction kick lately, and I have been since probably the start of my 20s. For some reason, like, the moment I turned 20, I was like, I like real stories, and so I started with that. But when I was a kid, I dove in to a lot of the sci-fi and dystopian books, like I had mentioned earlier. I had mentioned Life as We Knew It was one that I remember very fondly, The Givers, like other kind of books that presented that different society to it.
Yeah.
And when I was reading, I was like, man, I really used to love books like that. But some of the other modern sci-fi that I look through, I'm like, I'm not as interested in this. So, like, I gravitate to it as much, and I'm wondering if it's because I see a lack of, like, female protagonists, where when growing up, you have all these dystopian books that did have the female protagonist and had all these different people who had similar experiences to mine, as opposed to just normally dudes in space. And I'm like, this is nice, but it's just not for me as much as it could be for, like, someone else who would be into that. I'm trying to think if I've read any other kind of sci-fi. Annihilation was one I read recently for a book club.
Okay, who's the author on that?
Jeff Vandermeer, I think, is his name. There's a trilogy, and I haven't read the other two because I'm bad. but I did read that first one for book club, and we really all enjoyed it. It was also similar in a way of understanding a different society. It's hard to explain because it's a very wacky concept for a book. So if there's anyone listening who's interested in it, definitely look it up. I'm not doing it justice, but I know at least the first book is pretty good, and then there's two more if you like where that came from.
Yeah. So do you read a lot of nonfiction? That's what you mentioned. Yeah.
So I really got on, like, a nonfiction essay, a personal essay kick, I want to say in college, because at the time I was going through, I think, every single year in college, I had at least one family member die, and I was looking for stories that were talking about grief and weren't being, let's hide it away, let's do this, but being very raw about their emotions and not feeling weird about it, because I can be closed off, and I can also be, no, I don't have feelings, and no, you most definitely do. Just having books to be able to reference, to be like, yes, this is the exact same thing I'm feeling, because I didn't have a reference for it at that point. I just knew it feels weird. I don't know what's going on. And so having that outlet there and seeing other stories in that way was transformative to me, because I think a lot of people think of nonfiction as just something that's boring, but it can be very therapeutic to write about your own stories, to relate it in a way that you can digest. I also, at the time, I was an intern for a local writer who was writing her memoir, and she had over 20 different books or different journals where she was like writing for 10 minutes a day of something in her life that was on her mind. And so my job was to type those into a very big Google Doc.
Really?
And so I was looking at those stories and was just fascinated by her life, number one. Her name is Valley Haggard, if you haven't heard of her before. She did Life in 10 Minutes. I don't think she's doing that right now, but she does like a lot of different adult creative writing classes and other like very healing experiences as well. And so that was definitely a turning point too, where I was like, I want more of this. Where can I find more of this?
Okay. Very cool. So like a lot of like memoirs and yeah, I love. What's your favorite memoir?
Oh, that's so hard. I remember in high school I was obsessed with The Glass Castle, and I need to reread it to get a refresher. Educated was another good one. Yeah. I really also loved, recently I read Crying in H Mart.
Yeah.
And that one I was like, oh, I'm devastated at every page turn, but I need more.
Yeah, no, that one was really good. Yeah, I loved Educated. I've read both of R. Eric Thomas's books. I'm a huge fan. Oh, I've got it right there. It's the pink one here for it. Yeah, that's he's very funny. Nice. Yeah, and I'm a minute older than you. He's the same age as me, or we're pretty close. So he's referencing stuff from like the 90s, and I'm like, yes, I love that moment. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like when Doechii references anything that's from like the 2000s. She said something about like, Lisa Frank lipstick on like your eyelids. I was like, yes, Lisa Frank, give it to me. Come back.
I know, yes. Doechii, I'm getting into. I'm trying to stay up on what's going on. So Is there anything, talking about the book, is there anything that we haven't hit on yet that you were hoping we would discuss?
I think that pretty much covers it. I think you covered all your bases of what the book's about, the different characters. And I think it's hard without delving too deep into, again, all these different things that are happening without spoiling things. So again, every other synopsis of it is very focused on like the overall message, and it's kind of like things happen, a whole lot of stuff happens, but you can't really say much more unless you want to spoil it. Yeah. Just again, if you are someone who probably is a little squeamish with stuff, or you are averse to like very frank discussions of very brutal realities, just tread carefully. I would still say read it because it's a very valuable piece of literature, but do be mindful of that.
Yeah. I didn't ask. I mean, I guess you said like what the vibe of the book is. It sounds dark.
Yes. It's a sobering, realistic in the way where it's not like the typical realistic fiction where it has like a happy spin of, yes, bad things happen. However, I guess it does to a capacity, but it's different from what I would say the typical book would. Like, especially different white authors have that kind of tendency to be like, look, the sun is always shining. And I've noticed in a lot of books by Black women, like, it's still optimistic, but in a very realistic way. Brown Girl Dreaming by Jacqueline Woodson is a very good example of that. Read that in grad school for when I was doing my master's in teaching for English, and just the way she ends it is... It's accepting what is, accepting the reality that's there, because it was her, I wouldn't say autobiography, it's a fictional or an autobiography, poetry hybrid book about her upbringing and talking about growing up as a Black girl during her childhood and what that looks like and how much longer do we have until we have achieved true equality. And it alludes at the end of the book, hey, we're still going to be on this for a bit. And I think that's a very common theme, again, that I've seen in those kinds of books.
Yeah. Yeah, and with this one as well. And I guess you answered it already. I always ask, who would you recommend this story for? I don't know if you want to expand on that a little bit.
I think I actually recommended this. There was a girl or a student in my class when I taught high school English who said, I want, like, a unique story, or I need a new book. What do you recommend? And I was like, Parable of the Sower. Just do it. I said, it's dark. She was like, perfect, and went for it. So, again, if you're someone who doesn't mind a very uncanny similarities to what we're going through right now, wouldn't be as shaken up by it, might be a good idea. Or someone who wants that reality validated. Like someone else sees it from their viewpoint. It's no, this is not an exaggeration. Like people are really going through this and what's going on. So anyone who's interested in that, just in general, it is a classic. So I know like you shouldn't have an audience be everyone should read it, because everyone should not read it, especially if you're like a younger, anything younger than like an older teen. Probably not appropriate yet, because I know the graphic novel version is rated for 16 and up, and I'm like, yeah, that's a pretty good place to be like, how about stick with the more fun sci-fi up until you get to a certain point where it's like, we're gonna introduce a little bit of reality here.
Okay. I love that. So yeah, very specific. And I wanted to give you a chance if there's anything you want to put a spotlight on, or anything you've got coming up.
Oh gosh. My first poetry chapbook came out a couple of years ago. I didn't get to promote it as much as I wanted to because there was a lot of stuff going on. So I've published it in 2023. It's called Agora, and it's an autobiographical poetry book, very short, 15 poems with images by my colleague I mentioned earlier, Christine Stoddard, paired with them, about my journey, like a coming of age story, ironically, since we're talking about that, of growing up with agoraphobia and what that's to overcome that, or just exist in a world where women especially are told like, hey, the world is a dangerous place. And then you're also trying to grapple with, I'm also like, I want to explore the world while also being mindful of that. And when people talk about irrational fears, it's some of the fears are not irrational, unfortunately. So how do you reckon with that while also living your life?
Yeah. Wow. I definitely am going to pick that up. That's really,
Thank you.
well, thank you for sharing that. And yeah, I've just been very impressed. You've got, like you said, you've lived so many lives.
I've lived like at least 10 lives. I feel like I start a new life every year, and I'm like, I'm really tired. I want to be consistent, please. I just don't think that's who I am.
Good for you. So anyway, thank you so much for coming on. This has been a blast, and I'm going to hit. Thank you for spending some time with me and my guest for an episode of Drinks in the Library. For more information about the show, you can find us on Instagram at Drinks in the Library, on the World Wide Web, drinksinthelibrary.com, or shoot me an email at drinkspod@gmail.com. Until next time, cheers.